Hi again. We're in The Rise of Adventism, edited by Edwin Scott Gaustad, and this is the chapter on Millerism by David Arthur. It's been seen already that there's, despite a lack of desire in this direction by the early Millerites, especially William Miller himself, to suppress the idea that somehow they are separating from the mainstream church, that tendency is definitely there by about 1840-41. And all of the tendency seems to be wrapped around the certainty of this date, 1843 at that point. The Great Disappointment, of course, hasn't happened yet, even its first phase. So everything seems to be centered around the idea that somehow this is revealed truth, and those who resist it are resisting the Holy Spirit, indeed the direct direction of God. So the discussion goes on. This action on the part of the General Conference, that is about 1843, not being just a speculation, but rather being a divinely revealed truth, this action on the part of the General Conference had the immediate effect of cutting off some who had been numbered among the Millerites. Two of the five most prominent lecturers, Henry Dana Ward and Henry Jones, were seldom heard from again. Jones later wrote, quote, "The set time of the Advent was made a standard of union, as I understood it, so that I was seemingly no longer one of the union." End of quote. A man such as N.N. Whiting was able to oppose time setting and yet remain active, but he seems an isolated case. J.V. Himes, in August 1842, felt compelled to state unequivocally his belief in the time feature. And here's a direct quote from Himes. "The time has come for me to say something respecting myself and my respected colleagues in connection with the cause we advocate. During the last 3 years I have given my special attention to the subject of Christ's second coming in the clouds of heaven as being near at hand. I am fully persuaded of the truth of the theory respecting it as advocated in this paper. I will say here once for all that I am confirmed in the doctrine of Christ's personal descent to this earth to destroy the wicked and glorify the righteous, sometime in the year 1843. End of quote. Newspapers, conferences, and preaching services were more than ever used to promote the time feature, and a series of camp meetings was set for the summer of 1842 to spread the time message. After some prodding, William Miller settled definitely on the year March 21, 1843 to March 21, 1844, using the Jewish calendar as the basis of his reckoning. By mid-1842, the Millerites' position on the time, the millennium, and the return of the Jews to Palestine had hardened. The time for discussion had ended, the time for unquestioning propagation had begun. On so vital a matter as Christ's second advent, there could be no disagreement. They were themselves so convinced of their truth that those who continued to disagree with them were increasingly seen as blind, unintelligent, and dishonest. They became more strident, more self-righteous, and the feeling of exclusive possession of truth was widespread. The opposition, too, was growing. Millerism had always encountered opposition. Some of the response to Miller's ideas was moderate and scholarly, and was treated in turn in the same fashion. Some was unthinking and ill-informed, and in such instances the Millerites sought to educate and inform. Some was nothing more than ridicule or abuse, and here the Millerites would ignore it or occasionally respond in kind. As the Millerites became more confirmed in their beliefs, more aggressive in their advocacy, and more inflexible toward disagreement, the opposition of all types grew apace, and the warfare between them grew more heated. In many places, it became more difficult for the Millerites to gain a hearing. Church doors, which had once been open to them, were now closed. Increasing numbers of ministers came out in opposition to their teachings. Adventists were often denied the right to express their views in social meetings or class studies. The religious press was more than ever closed against their arguments, while stepping up their refutations and attacks. In some churches, ministers who held to Miller's views were brought to trial and dismissed. Laymen were sometimes dismissed from church membership for claiming to be believers in Millerism or for insisting on their right to speak their views freely. Ridicule was used against them and falsehoods were widely circulated. Yet the Millerites were the initiators, the aggressors. It was they who were propagating, indeed trying to force acceptance of new views. They had expressed these vigorously in their churches and public meetings and had questioned their ministers before congregations. They had established their own meetings, presses, associations, conferences, camp meetings, despite their assertions that they were not trying to disrupt or divide the churches or to establish a new one. Their spirit was sometimes ungenerous and censorious, causing the leaders to admonish their followers. While believing themselves to have laid aside sectarian views, they had in truth established their own. All that remained was the call for a final break. The year 1843 witnessed a major increase in all areas of Millerite activity. Publications flowed from the presses in record numbers. Book depots were established in 12 cities from Boston to St. Louis. New newspapers were established. Many tent and camp meetings were held. Public meetings and lectures increased in number, and general conferences were held. Excitement reached new heights, and frenetic activity was the order of the day. When the outer limits of Miller's time calculation expired without the coming of the expected Christ, disappointment was real and error was confessed. But then a new time movement arose, led by S.S. Snow, which fixed on October 22nd, 1844, as the specific day of Christ's return. The resulting excitement and expectation was greater than the first, and so was the following disappointment. Given the emotional climate of these months, it's not surprising that the question of Millerism's relationship to the churches became a burning issue. As activity increased, emotions were heightened and tensions between Millerites and non-Millerites grew apace. With increased frequency, both pulpit and press found it necessary to speak out on the subject. Questions were being asked. What shall we do? Shall we remain in our present churches? Shall we withdraw from them? If we do withdraw, what shall we then do? The editors of Signs of the Times wrote, quote, "We have received several lengthy communications denouncing churches and church membership, some more and some less severe. The introduction of any question into our columns not connected with the doctrine of the Advent, and respecting which there are various opinions among those who are looking for the Lord, would tend to withdraw our minds from the more important question and produce disunion among ourselves." End of quote. This position was typical of the moderates. They preferred not to agitate the question because they considered it divisive and tangential. Only under the greatest pressure would they address themselves to this problem, and then their advice was cautious. Quote, "With regard to our church relations, as Adventists, we are differently situated. It may be the duty of some to change their relationship and of others to retain it. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. While a person can see his own duty plain, he may not be able to decide what may be the duty for others who are differently situated." End of quote. The editors continued by reminding Millerites of their duty to witness and warn, and to do so in a good spirit. In concluding, they stated, "If in thus doing our duty, and the church will not be warned, let them take the responsibility of expelling us." William Miller's position with regard to this question was in harmony with that of the moderates. He never advised Adventists to separate. Rather, he said, quote, "He had ever and at all times advised Adventists to stay in their respective churches." End of quote. Miller had himself remained a member of the Baptist Church of Lowhampton until excluded in late 1844. Yet there were times when Miller was more severe. At a conference in Boston in the winter of 1844, this is a direct quote, "He spoke of the mother of harlots, which all Protestants admit to be the papacy, and remarked that if the Roman Church was the mother of harlots, then her daughters must be the harlots, and therefore that portion of the Protestant Church that imitate and partake of the spirit of the old mother must be the daughters referred to." End of quote. Noting that he had always advised remaining in the churches unless cast out, he now said God had ordered otherwise, and that many Adventists were leaving voluntarily because of the treatment accorded their fellows. F.G. Brown, who had earlier criticized those who denigrated the ministry and the churches, wrote in 1844 that he was no longer sure of his position. He now believed that much could be said in favor of entirely withdrawing from all church connections, and wondered aloud whether continued association meant tacit approval of the course that they had been pursuing. "You will understand," he wrote to Sylvester Bliss, "that my own duty is not entirely clear to my mind." This was the dilemma of a growing number of moderates. In response to an inquiry as to what course Adventists should follow in a small town in northern New York, where the clergy all opposed any discussion of the Second Advent, the editors of the Signs replied, "We do not hesitate in such a case to advise our suffering brethren to come out from such a persecuting church and hold meetings by themselves in peace." When the Christian Herald asserted that the Adventists were forming a new sect, the Advent Herald replied that if the churches wished to keep their members, they must feed them with that bread which cometh down from heaven, which is meat in due season. If this is withheld, the children of God must of necessity go where they can partake of that which alone can satisfy their souls. End of quote. Adventists were justified in their actions, quote, "where the doctrine of the Advent is shut out of the church." End of quote. Another Millerite lecturer, Silas Hawley, had for several months been advising separation on practical grounds. Concerning the condition of converts won in Adventist meetings, he wrote, quote, "There is one thing in reference to these converts that should be noticed. The great mass of them have not joined any of the existing sects. They stand by themselves. Nearly all such are living, thriving Christians, and strong in their belief of the speedy advent. But most of those who have connected themselves with any of the sects are dying in religion and are giving up the doctrine of the speedy appearing." End of quote. To join the church, he concluded, seems to be the direct way to kill the soul of religion, and he advised all not to be entangled with the yoke of bondage. It's not over yet. I'll put in a link to what is Babylon the Great? Here you have a great many of these Adventist folks who seem to think that Babylon is, yes, it's the churches. Not yet the world empire of false religion that it would become in the days of Rutherford, however, but rather the churches that imitated Rome in resisting, specifically here, this new idea of the Second Advent. I'll put in a link, therefore, to the first of 4 videos we've got so far on what is Babylon the Great in the book of Revelation.